start recording because at least two of your colleagues are ill and can't come in today, and I want to make sure that we have everything recorded for them. Um, these three articles have a lot to them. Okay. In fact, I was talking with one of your colleagues earlier, actually two of your colleagues earlier today. Um, oh God. Crackers. Well, I see. I like crackers, and I'm a big water fan. But if that's all you can ingest, then that's just not good. So then it begs the question: why are you here instead of sleeping and resting and watching this when it's recorded later on? But I mean, that's very good soldier of you to kind of, I can do this, power through. No, whiskey is overrated when you're sick. It really is. Whiskey's much better when you're well than it is when you're sick. Um, there are other kinds of rocket fuel type beverages that will ease your suffering if you're not feeling well. I'm not convinced that whiskey is one of them. I know for sure coffee isn't. What are you gonna do? All right. Anyway, what came up in both of the discussions I had today and one discussion I had yesterday with somebody in another class is that it used to be when I was a student all the way through to when I first started teaching, students coming into this kind of class would have had background in a lot of this already. And that's not because teachers were better then than they are now, or students were better then than they are now. It was because there was a lot more interest in the so-called developing world 20 or 30 years ago than there is now. But, sort of more than a generation of kind of Reagan, post-Reagan, turbo capitalism, market forces, all that kind of stuff, devil take the hindmost, has really kicked in. And as a consequence of that, most of you, if not all of you, grew up in a political and economic environment where these kinds of discussions just weren't had anymore. People didn't care about sub-Saharan Africa anymore. People didn't care about Southeast Asia or South Asia anymore. Unless we were going into some place and killing people and occasionally getting killed, no one really cares. That has changed significantly. For all the talk of globalization and everything else, the actual on-the-ground working understanding of other parts of the world that aren't comfortably linked into global capitalism, I would argue is significantly less than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Certainly the interest is significantly less. I think it's a reflection of the prevailing lack of interest by American scholars and also by the American state. That kind of research doesn't get lavish funding. No one's talking about as much, at least, about that. People keep looking into ideas about, they keep using terms like miracle, like, they talk about the BRICS and these economic miracles, the way they used to talk about, the dragons and things like that, or in Ireland, a Celtic tiger, which of course was not a miracle, it was a fraud. Okay. It wasn't development. And Ireland, for all that it's wonderful in many ways, is not a developed country in terms of a stable economy, a diverse economy, the kinds of things that we look at. But the one thing that's been a common denominator for any but sort of radical scholars really has been the idea that if you want to talk about development, you have to have growth. And the model of development is economic growth. In the first couple of things here that with the US Grand Strategy article and the theories of dependency and globalization, both of them make that point pretty compellingly. The third is a complete critique of that. It's an absolute assault on that assumption of a growth-driven model of what is referred to as development. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's then go ahead and look at this first notion of the development state, because it does seem, particularly in the midst of the Cold War and everything else, actually the early stages too of the Cold War, it seems odd to think that the United States would sort of lead this charge for kind of state managed capitalism and things like that. I'm going to suggest to you it's not odd at all, and that the author is exaggerating the oddness of it. But it is interesting in terms of that model and the reason why the United States would back it. So, Kyle, are you ready to go on that?
Pretty much as ready as I'm ever going to be at this
Okay,
point.
fire away.
But yeah, so basically what this U.S. Grand Strategy article is about is it's comparing Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and basically is a couple of case studies on how the US deals with developing or not developing those states. So it takes the cases of like Korea, Japan, and weighs it against the Philippines and like Singapore and those kind of countries. So the general idea is that because of the perceived threats, the strategical threats that the US faces, in the case of communism for Japan, Korea, and Thailand, they invest significantly more resources, and they also invest a lot of resources into controlling the state and saying the state should do this and shouldn't do this. They put hard controls on a series of economic mandates. They focus on secondary production as opposed to primary production, and they basically kind of very handheld guide these states along through their kind of like economic growth path. Whereas in Southeast Asia, they effectively don't invest nearly as many military resources or economic resources, and they don't exert the same kind of control as they normally would in the other states they try to develop. I guess it's like that's like the main take of the article, I guess.
Okay, there was a question about Singapore. At the beginning of this period of time, in the immediate aftermath of the war, Singapore was not independent. Didn't I think Singapore, was it 64, 65 that Singapore became independent?
I don't
Yeah.
know off the top of my head.
Is that right?
But Indonesia became independent, and then Singapore became independent of Indonesia at some point. And I'm curious.
Well, I think you're thinking of Malaysia.
Okay, yeah, my bad.
Yeah, Malaysia.
Yeah, the old British Malaysia.
Right, and it's one of the reasons why the United States was not more involved in Singapore. Had less to do with not a perceived threat of communism, and a lot more to do with the fact that the British were there, essentially.
Yeah.
The British were the ones sort of doing that, however imperfectly, in Singapore, and we were sort of agreeing to stay out of their way. It was what was one of the few remnants of the British sphere of influence after the Second World War, for as little as that lasted. We can, if we have time, we can get into that, but yeah, that would be that. Now, the thing that's peculiar about this, though, at least according to the author, it's not that the United States was involved in this Cold War and was posturing as anti-communist. We know that, okay? And it wasn't even that we intervened in sort of North Asia to the extent that we did because of communism, whereas communism wasn't a threat anywhere else. Because the obvious example of that is Latin America. Okay, because of Central America and the Caribbean, because of Cuba, because of the chronic instability throughout Central and South America, and the fact that the United States any number of times had intervened with occupying governments in the early part of the 20th century, at least in Central America, those cases don't quite fit in the same way. The distinction that the author's trying to draw, okay, is the idea that not that we intervened, but that we intervened by encouraging and nurturing a very strong centralized state to guide the economy, okay? And Lee argues that, is it Lee, James Lee? Yeah, James Lee argues that, that's unusual for the United States, and it's something of an aberration, as I understand him. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds accurate, because he makes the point. He also makes the point that Latin America, you could use force. You could just go in and like kill a government and it'd be fine, because there wasn't a major power that you're going up against, right? Whereas the whole reason why the Korean War is a thing is the fact that China can intervene at any point, at least might, if you try to take over a government militarily.
That's according to Lee. It's the proximity of China and North Korea, and particularly of China, because North Korea is seen at this point, probably justifiably, as a surrogate of North Korea. It's sort of a, the Baltic state, or the Eastern Europe of China is North Korea. It's so wonderfully strategically placed that it's an imminent threat, especially, remember, after our intervention, sort of disastrous intervention in the Korean Peninsula. One of the things, and Lee points this out, we learned, hey, don't go up against the Chinese National Army. It's a bad idea. But he seems to suggest that the United States was more characterized by small government, kind of, strong reliance on market forces and the sort of natural corrective mechanisms of the market and kind of real, let's say, neoclassical economics or something like that. Kyle, you're well versed in economics, arguably more so than I am. Does that, think about the United States circa 1950 to 55.
Well, 50 to,
Tell
50
me
to
if that
55,
sounds
yeah.
right.
It's Reagan era is 70.
Reagan era is
Yeah.
functionally, let's say 80, because Carter was already deregulating, but it's the
Yeah.
80s on. It's not really stopped.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like when real growth stops for a large number of people is like the early 70s, I think, if I remember correctly. But
That's right. That's what
yeah.
yielded the Reagan era. It's that loss of faith, in fact, in a lot of things.
In a variety of Keynesian economics, and there's a whole. Anyway, I read a book similarly about that. But 55, when you look at that time period, is Keynesian economics is still. It's falling off.
It's still pretty strong.
But it's still pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's one of those things where, like, I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that the U.S. was very pro-free market at that period in time, but you could make the argument, at least, I guess, more clearly when you get into like the 60s, of the leadership of the U.S. Like, when you get into like 65, I guess the plans are already set in like the 50s at this point, right? But if you got to like a 65, 63 period where the leadership of the U.S. government starts to become more neoclassical and Friedman is like popping up in and out of that circle, but you're not going to get.
Friedman is a marginal figure until the 1970s.
Well, yeah, but the thing is that with the initial leadership, he pops it back in and out for a bit, and there's the monetarists and all that great stuff. But you're not going to get like strong leadership from somebody like Friedman until the 70s.
See, because what I think he leaves out of this, summarizing the model, and there is a really good summary where he talks about the notion of establishing stability, right? Because of a perceived imminent threat. There's a little There's
the patron client threat model that he thinks of.
He does that patron client model, and a lot of the arrangements and analyses of post World War II intervention development use that patron client model in one way or another. But he starts out with this idea of there's this sort of perceived level of threat. This is on page 743, and when the perceived level of threat is high, the priority of the patron, in this case, the United States, is just stabilize things. Because if you don't, it opens up opportunities for the allure of communism, right?
Yeah.
That the big appeal of communism was that if you were a smallholder, or particularly if you were a peasant, struggling with subsistence agriculture and the intervention of capitalism and the militarization of economies and everything, communism looked pretty damn good.
Yeah, which is why they actively redistribute land. Which actually, I think that might actually be one thing that's surprising, in contrast to like the policymakers in Washington, but not particularly surprising. I guess. Like,
be more specific, because I'm seeing some furrowed brows here from people who might not have the same background.
Sorry, yeah. The idea is that you'd never have the same policy in the U.S. And the U.S. is more developed, of course, right? Which is why you have this in the first place.
Right.
But you're not. There's nobody in Washington at this point saying we should redistribute land, right? That's not in, at least not in the U.S. For foreign policy, obviously, it's different, right? But at the very least, there is. How do I put this? Oh gosh. In James's like trying to draw a difference between like America neoclassicalism, which doesn't really exist, this is the one point where there would be a difference between like stereotypical American policy and policy executed in, like, say, Korea or Japan.
Let's come back to that. Because the assumption, Lee's assumption, is that the United States after the Second World War and the full mobilization, the entire mobilization of this massive industrial economy focused on a national imperative, right? The nationalization, for the only time in American history, the nationalization of the American economy. We didn't do it in World War I. We didn't arguably do it in the Civil War because we split as a nation and couldn't, right? And also you couldn't as expeditiously nationalize the early industrial economy of the mid 19th century in the way that you could in the mid 20th century. Does that make sense what I'm saying there when I talk about the nationalization of the
Yeah,
economy?
yeah. I see what you mean there. Yeah.
Where we're, what you're talking about is the government intervening, at least in the case of the United States, as a very, very intrusive interventionist regulatory state, saying, for example, General Motors, okay, you've got to make our tanks for us. Now we're going to pay you for those tanks, right? We're not going to, in other words, we don't own you, General Motors, but we can tell you what to produce.
Yeah.
Okay. I've mentioned this before, I think, but this is important to remember that from 1941, really till 1945, you could not buy a new American car because they didn't exist. Okay, you couldn't buy a new American refrigerator because they didn't exist. I mean, the whole industrial capacity, but particularly large, durable manufactured goods, all that energy went into making like Superfortress bombers and tanks and trucks and massive fighter planes and all these magnificent innovations in destruction, right? That was the American industrial economy, okay? And there was a lot of doing without as a consequence of that. But for our purposes here, there was a tremendous amount of state intervention. That arguably starts with the early Franklin Roosevelt administration and the New Deal. So we've got a period of time from roughly, let's say 1933 through 1945, where the American state is running a lot of the show.
Yeah.
Okay. But more importantly, all right, and this I think that Lee should have pointed out. I think he's not wrong. I think he's cooking the books a little bit. There was a whole generation of management specialists and what people were called technocrats.
Yeah.
Came out at this time, came out of all these universities, right? And the general mantra there, following on Keynesian economics, the idea of using the government to manage the economy, not socializing it. This was not socialism, but it was managed capitalism, the way a lot of European countries do now. Okay, but the idea was, look what this did for our economy. It was nothing but good. Look at the innovations. Look at the full employment. Look at all, if we demobilize that, we're going to go into a prolonged recession. But more importantly, not only will we stagnate, but this is an engine of development. So I'm going to suggest that Lee is underestimating the seductive power of the development state within the United States. As long as you have the major factors of production on board with that development state, the way for the most part you did have during the Second World War and parts of the Depression, as long as they're making their profits, I don't think they really care what they're making, right? Yeah. That, in other words, there was a sense there that the American people had accepted a much larger role for government because of the Depression and the mobilization for war. That's really important to remember. The United States in 1955 was nothing like the United States now, okay? In terms of the perceived role of the government, the expectation of the people that the government was there for them, that's gone. The government as often as not, we're taught, your generation is taught, is an adversary. It's gonna stop you from doing things. That is a very different mindset from what prevailed coming out of the Second World War and the Depression. When you asked Americans, about the role of government, it was overwhelming majorities of Americans insisted that it was the responsibility of the government to guarantee us a job. Okay, imagine people saying that now. Yeah, just now, like your generation might go back to that. You know why? Because the private sector isn't doing it. Okay, when the private sector can't do something or won't do something, the only recourse you have is government. Okay, my point here is that there were plenty of people who in various ways were advocating this notion of state-driven development. Even Samuel Huntington, when he was writing, and this was 1968, when he's writing Political Order and Changing Societies, is arguing, look, we've got to consolidate the authority of the institutional apparatus and the authority of the state, because any economic transformation is going to be destabilizing. And we got to stabilize these situations in these post-colonial countries and these post-World War II economies. If we don't do that, they'll fail. Okay, so I don't know that you get that from reading this. I think my impression is if you read this, you might think, oh yeah, the United States was just like it was in the Reagan years, or just like it is now, where there was a real hostility to government intervention and government regulation. That's just simply not the case.
He takes the narrative in a wrong space and a bit too far.
Can you say that again? Because I kind of stepped on
Sorry,
you.
he takes the narrative in slightly the wrong time period and a bit too far.
I think maybe he does. But the idea is, anyway, that one of the things we can extract from this is there was at least a period of time where the Soviets weren't the only ones talking about a state-driven economy, but in terms of managing the economy, I think of this as sort of super regulation. The United States was right on board. Even though I would suggest, in terms of the United States vis-a-vis its hemisphere, right? When you look at Central and South America and the extent to which the United States intervened economically there, it was to build up authoritarian superstates, in a sense. I mean, yeah, we could do business with them and we preserved private property. The big struggle was private property, private ownership of capital, but regulated by a strong authoritarian state. It's what Gabriel O'Donnell referred to as bureaucratic authoritarianism. Those were the regimes we were comfortable dealing with, as long as they weren't socialist or communist. Because this is the thing that I don't think Lee is defining clearly enough. All state intervention isn't socialism. And the United States had no interest in going socialist, but it had no interest at all in allowing the major industrial and manufacturing enterprises of the United States to have to survive on their own. That's just simply untrue. We did not immediately revert back to a complete free market, strip away the regulatory state. Much of the state that had built up during Roosevelt and the Depression and the Second World War remained in place. That's the executive branch of government, the central regulatory state. That didn't go away. Now, this is important, though, because it did after the First World War. And so, insofar as it even existed, it did after the Civil War. And it did after a lot of other things. The Spanish-American War did not draw us into a strong central state. World War I did not draw us into a perpetual strong central state. But since the Second World War, we have had a very strong central state, one that could intervene forcefully, when the factors of capital demanded it, right? And that, I think that exists to this day. So does the argument, though, that he's making, just generally, not just to Kyle, but to everybody else, does the argument make sense that in order to fight the ultimate statism, which is communism or industrial socialism, the United States did support, in different parts of the world, a kind of state-driven management of the economy, but it fell well short of socialism? Now, the reason for that, and again, and Kyle, this was not on you to explain this, was that the prevailing model very much was that model of growth. Okay, even he mentions very briefly NSC 68. National Security Council Memorandum 68 was drafted and released right before we intervened in Korea in 1950. Okay, even though that is a national security document, there is a lot of discussion in there about industrial capacity and economic growth, because there's an absolute article of faith there that as long as world capitalism continues to grow, and the United States is the leader in world capitalism, as long as that continues, we can contain the belligerent, imperative to advance of Soviet socialism, of the slave state and all that, okay? So there's an ideological imperative behind this as well, but ultimately it's economic. The ideological notion of anti-communism is largely to justify the dislocations imposed on people by capitalism. And that's not an anti-capitalist statement, that's a fact. Capitalism is destabilizing. Every economist understands that. That's why has the classic and somewhat beautiful term for capitalism is creative destruction.
Coined by a Marxist, though, but it's okay.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are a couple of people simultaneously developed that notion.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's that notion that this is a powerful engine of transformation. Any powerful engine of transformation is dangerous. Any powerful engine of transformation, like capitalism, is going to destabilize the conventional order. People are going to have to adapt. And so the appeal of communism, particularly the kind of, sort of rural or peasant modalities of communism that were coming out of Asia, the appeal of that was, we don't want to prey upon you. We don't want to exploit you. We want to feed you and we want to protect you. Okay. That sounded a lot better to a lot of people than that Western model, which is essentially an imperial and colonial model, which says, we're going to come in, we're going to control all the major factors of production here with multinational corporations, and we're going to be running the show. Okay. But you'll be better off for it. I mean, that was kind of the appeal. And so in order to facilitate that, the United States would, from time to time and in different parts of the world, embrace more of a statist model of development. We were understanding the importance of the state as a stabilizing mechanism, in the midst of the inevitable dislocations of capitalist development. That's the point. Growth is wonderful in the sense that it provides capital, it provides opportunity, but it can intrude upon political space. It can intrude upon the individual security of people who are displaced by the mechanisms of that growth, and all this kinds of stuff, can happen. And so you need the state to manage that. That's essentially Lee's argument, I think. Kyle, is that fair?
Yeah. One quick thing, because you mentioned that it's not socialist, like that you're using this to avoid socialism. But the one thing that seems socialist to me would be redistributing land. Like that would be, like if you're taking away land from like the kind of.
I'm gonna give you a phrase, and you tell me if this is socialist. 40 acres and a mule. What's that from?
Wait, oh shoot. Oh God.
That's an American development policy. It's a way of breaking up the old plantations and ensuring after, this was not, by the way, necessarily supposed to apply to people of color, but to poor whites in the South especially. This was a model that had always been there. Jefferson talking about the yeoman farmer and all that, the idea that what we didn't want is vast expanses of agriculture with no opportunity for small freeholding farmers and stuff like that. That's land tenure. Okay, so these were not so much massive barrel of the gun land redistribution policies. These were essentially land tenure policies. They had some of the same effects, but the argument was that ultimately, in a way that nationalizing land and forcibly redistributing it did not do, it retained, insofar as was possible, sort of the sanctity of private property.
Yeah, that makes more
socialism
sense.
is you're compromising that right to the protection of private property.
Yeah.
Didn't Huey Long do something similar with Share Our Wealth and Every Man a King and all that?
Well, he did it rhetorically, but he also had to manage massive oil interests in Louisiana, which were economies of scale. So he tried to. He was what is sometimes referred to as a right-wing populist. And I guess the left-wing version of that would have been Upton Sinclair in California and places like that. But there were a number of people around that period of time who were kind of anti-plutocrat. Remember that even Franklin Roosevelt, who himself was fabulously wealthy, right? When he campaigned in 1932, he was very disparaging of the plutocrats, the rich people. So everyone was using that populist rhetoric, and to some extent, all the prevailing models of responding to the Depression were populist in the sense of saying, we're going to intervene in the economy, and if the government is taking tax money and creating programs and creating jobs, that's all economic redistribution. The question is, at what point does it become socialism? Okay, well, for our purposes, it would be to the extent that you sacrifice private property rights and have a public space where things are done, that's socialism. But really, the New Deal wasn't doing very much of that. It really wasn't. Not compared, for example, to some of the socialism we've seen in Scandinavian countries, or certainly the socialism that we saw in the Soviet Union, or China, or things like that, where essentially the state owned these things. Okay, we're not talking about state-owned enterprises. We're talking about the state compelling the redistribution of land, but that land to be held in private rather than in common, which would be socialism. Does that make sense? Because for the most part, the United States, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, absolutely opposed widespread coercive land redistribution programs, because the idea was you're breaking up these large plantations when we want those, because we want them to produce that export agriculture, which is by definition an economy of scale. If you break all that up, they're going to lose that export component of their economy, and they will, we can't exploit that. We can't use that. We can't get things produced cheaply that we can convert into expensive things through manufacture. Okay, so that's kind of where that article is going. It's an interesting, this is only like the third or fourth time I've looked at this. This is the first time when I taught the class where I included this article, but it is an interesting idea that, in the context of the Cold War, yeah, isn't it strange that we appeared to abandon free market principles? We did nothing of the sort, okay, because we didn't fully embrace them anywhere else, including within our own borders. The government was free to intervene when General Motors or anybody else called them in and said, hey, we need intervention. Even under Reagan, I mean, you had the bailing out of Chrysler, and we had another big auto bailout under Obama that had been started under George W. Bush. I mean, the government's always been bailing out large companies when they've acted irresponsibly and failed. This is not new. This is just not new. The difference between that and socialism, though, is that there's no permanent state ownership of these enterprises. That would be socialism. In other words, remember when you were just been little kids, but when under Obama, the government actually bought large shares of auto manufacturers. It owned parts of them. But remember, that was temporary to give them liquidity so they could work their way out of these difficulties without collapsing and putting tens of thousands of people out of work, hundreds of thousands ultimately of people out of work. But the government ultimately sold off those shares. It does not own a controlling interest in any private company in the United States. Okay, that's important. That's why it's not socialist. But that's also not confidence in the free market. Well, I don't know what you mean by that when you say quantitative easing is a weird time.
I don't know, like the idea that it was unprecedented for the Fed to do that kind of deal making at that point of buying up toxic assets and stuff like that. But
that's not quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is just printing more money.
Well, there's money supply.
It's a monetarist policy. It has to do with controlling the supply of money.
Well, so, oh God.
You're going to lose us, Kyle. We're all going to hate you.
Yeah, I know.
We'll never speak to you again.
Because
Kyle, you're wrong. When do I ever tell anybody you're wrong?
I don't know if that's accurate, but because it's.
You know what? If you can frame, I think I know where you're going, but it's a little bit of a sideline, which is okay as long as it doesn't become a cul-de-sac. Can we move on? And then if you think of that, make a note or something, and we can come back to it. Okay? All right. So, a lot of you, I'm understanding that, you may not have had time yet to look at this. This is technically the second week of this module, so do take some time to look at this, okay? Let's see. Are there any other questions about that article, though? The main point being that there was this model of development that was used by the United States and advocated by the United States in certain parts of the world. Because of Bretton Woods, we created these institutions to make these massive infusions of capital into various parts of the world. And the idea was, okay, we're going to give you these massive infusions of capital. First, it was the Marshall Plan. Then it was, ultimately, it was, the World Bank and the IMF and things like this. But the idea is, we're going to work with the state to manage that, to some extent to plan certain kinds of development, but the emphasis is going to be on export-driven production and things like that. All right? Which doesn't sound much like Reagan's America or something like that. All right. What about theories of dependency and globalization? There is a lot in this. We talked about a little bit about this earlier today. If you can give us the flyover, then you can default to me if we need to fill in the gaps.
Okay, yeah. So I'll try to make this make as much sense as I can. But so dependency theorists came about like to criticize the failure of classical dependency or classical development theory because it doesn't take into account the failure of the states when it or countries that are trying to develop when it follows patterns of developed countries, and one of these patterns go into like comparative advantage. So like a country will specialize in producing a product the cheapest way they can, and will find another place to produce or take materials they need and trade with these countries the cheapest ways possible. So yeah, dependency theorists criticize like when underdeveloped countries did this or now I'm lost. Reasoning, dependency theorists.
Mark your place, because now I want to make sure this is going to get real quickly back to Kyle. When you were talking about quantitative easing and the state, okay, I mean, I'm trying to see if I can tie these two things together. Were you talking about that the notion within quantitative easing of buying assets, like buying its own government bonds or other assets, which would include shares in the auto industry?
Yeah, so QE is a weird term. So the Fed normally buys like just government stuff and only long term. QE basically I'd mixed up terms for a bit. Quantitative easing basically refers to when they do the exact same thing with different assets.
Yeah, right.
So like it's more of like they'll basically, it's a riskier version of what the Fed normally does, is what it is.
Yeah, because they'll buy, as you said, I think you used the term toxic assets. They may not necessarily be toxic, but they're problematic.
Yeah, there was a different time when they actually did buy toxic assets, which wouldn't be quantitative easing. That would just
that almost becomes speculation. Yeah,
it's not speculation. It's trying to prevent that and like organizing bank buyouts, and there's like that whole mess that happens. And yeah, but that's kind of different.
Okay, what I would tying back into to bridge back into this article, right? What I think you can think about with starting with sort of classical economic theory is the idea that anything that promotes growth, generally speaking, is of benefit in a capitalist economy, right? But the dependency argument is it's not necessarily a rejection of that. So what's the difference between dependency theory and classical economics, which is minimal interest by the state, right? And where it does intervene, it's to stimulate growth.
Yeah. Classical development, like economics, they believe like this globalization is a good thing and it benefits all parties. When dependency theorists believe that it's only benefiting the developed countries. So that's why there's like this dependence. So they bring in, like they also say dependency theorists, some of them argue that some states have a relationship with powerful elites and they take their interests more into account of the people working.
Okay, now this is why I sort of flashed back for a second and did that callback with Kyle on quantitative easing and stuff like that, because one of the concerns about capitalist development and that led to questions that led to dependency theory was just because there are investments that are made, say through the World Bank or the IMF or even, direct foreign investment from other economies, okay, doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to be producing the kind of growth that's going to stimulate an economy and get someone out of that cycle of dependent development. And one of the reasons for that was the idea of a kind of what was sometimes called a comprador class or something like that, where you take elites within the, let's say, the client country, and the patron would be either the World Bank or the IMF or the United States or Britain or Saudi Arabia or whoever was investing the capital, right? That money, that wealth would go to elites, and those elites would control that wealth and determine where it went, which, say in the case of Nigeria, for example, when it started exporting oil, a lot of times where that wealth went was to Swiss bank accounts. A lot of that capital just flew, right out of the developing economy, never giving it the opportunity to develop because it was controlled by these elites who were sort of aligned with the interest of capital rather than the interest of their own country. That's what he's talking about there. Does that make sense? We saw the same thing happen in Russia after the collapse of communism. $1 trillion goes into Russia and vanishes. Well, yeah, because a bunch of gangsters took it. So what else?
Oh, I just have it. So dependency theorists. Something with classical development theory. They don't really bring a solution, and dependency theorists is like a solution to like get out of this dependency is like a mixture of like neo-Marxist traditions and like reformists. The neo-Marxists think like this underdevelopment can be overcome with socialist revolutions, and reformists are more like there needs to be a change in the international economic system. So like if an underdeveloped country wants to be developed like in a certain part of the state, there needs to be some structural changes in the state. It can't really, or it needs to like fall apart. It can't really.
Okay, and one of those, this isn't clear from the article, one of those is what used to be called import substitution industrialization, ISI. This was a reform. This was not Marxism. And this was Raoul Prebisch, who that you mentioned in the article, one of the reformers. ECLA, the study group for Latin America that was advising Latin American countries on policy. The idea was the cycle of dependency can be broken if the dependent country can wall itself off from the imports coming from outside and substitute for those imports that it manufactures by industrializing. That is, it can take infusions of capital, develop an industrial infrastructure of its own, instead of importing its finished goods from China or from the United States or from Japan, depending on the period of time, right? It was called import substitution industrialization. Because part of the cycle of dependency, particularly for the reformists, was it wasn't capitalism, it was a failure to industrialize. Okay, because industrialization is what keys this massive growth cycle of modern capitalism, is the capacity to industrialize. Okay, so the point here, as you're saying, is you're not rejecting capitalism. You're trying to improve yourself structurally so that you're more competitive. Okay. So it doesn't, dependency theory doesn't have to be, a bunch of Marxists sitting around and hating capitalism. I think that's your point, and that you're right. That comes out in the article. How does that compare then with theories of globalization? Because we get these three different models of globalization.
Yeah, so there's these hyper globalizers, skeptics, and transformationalists. The hyper globalizers think that there's such like an integration because of the. Hold on, wait. I don't think I'm reading the right thing. Because of like the developed countries' practice of like producing the cheapest things, there's like this dependent, or like they're subjugated to the global marketplace. And
according to whom?
The hyper globalizers.
Well, do hyper globalizers like globalization?
Yeah.
Why would they like things to be subjugated? That seems mean.
Yeah, it's they. I'm not
So
trying to
are hyper globalizers mean?
no,
Are they just rotten people?
no, but I don't know why. Yeah, I didn't really understand why they thought it was a good thing.
Because it's an engine of growth.
Okay.
Yeah, so the hyper globalizers, you were almost there. The hyper globalizers argue, look, on balance, this is a great thing. Okay, because we don't have just, it's not about economic regionalism. Yeah, there are going to be winners and losers because this is capitalism, and capitalism destroys inefficiencies. The theory is because of the, the corrective mechanism of market forces, right? Okay, but what this is going to do through this dynamic volatility of globalizing the means of production, change, supply chains, distribution, opening new markets, all these exciting new things. Yeah, they're going to be destabilizing, and it's going to be rugged. But what's going to come out of that is you're going to find a whole new cohort of winners who once were losers. So it rejects the permanence, the kind of the stale inertia of dependency, and says, no, this is the galvanic shock that could pull a lot of that could take Vietnam and put it on a path to development, just like was the case, say, with Taiwan or with Singapore or whatever, right? Because it will have the entire globe as its potential market. And it will have the access to the supply chain of entire globe. That will encourage more competition because people will have to compete at a global level for the goods and services that they provide, or even the raw materials that they export. There'll be, this dynamic global market. That would be the hyper globalizers, the ones who are like, no, this is a destabilizing thing. But on balance, this is capitalism. This is how it works. This is the next and most powerful stage of capitalism.
Does that go into like the idea of like a lot of these globalization theorists believe the reason for underdevelopment isn't much because of international policies, but more like bad governance?
Yes. Yeah. And I would suggest that, although it's not super clear in the article, that some of the kind of mid-level globalists, the transformationalists, kind of agree as well. That I'm not exactly sure why he used the term transformational. Doesn't he call them transformationalists? Am I getting that wrong?
I think that's what he called it.
Well, now I feel stupid. I'm totally spacing. I'm sorry. It's here.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, transformationalist. The idea is that they're split. They're the moderates on this, and they're a lot like the kind of ECLA people and Raoul Prebisch and the people who are willing to concede a certain dilemma of dependency. Okay, but they didn't advocate revolutionary responses to it. And the big concern for the transformationalists is, it's this dislocation, it's this instability, it's the cultural implications of this. The reactions of people to these processes can be problematic. So they're not as euphoric about globalization. I think don't you think? I think that would be fair to say.
Yeah.
What about what makes the global skeptics skeptical? That's the third component of this, and the least optimistic, obviously, because of the name. What makes them skeptical about globalization?
Isn't it like because they agree that there's these inequalities between elites and the outside, that there's certain types of capitalism that can really exploit people. Like I think he used like market capitalism compared to industrial capitalism.
Well, industrial capitalism is a variation of market. All capitalism is market capitalism, ultimately.
I forget what it was.
Ultimately, at least in theory.
Maybe that wasn't what he used, but it was industrial capitalization and something else.
Because if you're industrializing, you're still subject to various market forces. You're subject to the market forces for the raw materials that you may well have to import in order to manufacture finished goods. So there's a market imperative there. The cost of production for you is mitigated or affected in part by what it costs you to get raw materials. So that's still a market.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the difference, what makes them skeptical, has to do with the conviction that the inequalities inherent in capitalism will not be obliterated by globalization. That those parts of the world that were losers before, however you define that, the stagnant or low growth, no growth, whatever, instability, chronic economic and political instability, they're going to remain that way they're more likely to remain the same way. That globalization ultimately is the expansion of Western style industrial capitalism. And that's a force that eats everything it can't buy and buys what it can't eat, and it doesn't leave a lot behind in terms of, a movement to, it is not an imperative to move toward equilibrium as equality. Capitalism is not about equality. Nothing that destroys inefficiency can possibly be about equality. Okay, it is about dominating market share. And that ultimately, the prospect for a Vietnam or even in India, in the short run, particularly with India, as massive a country as it is, look at the way they're struggling with COVID. Now, the hyperglobalists would say, and indeed many of the transitional or transformational globalists would say, India's problem is India. India's problem is not globalization. India's problem is India. That this COVID problem, the shortage of oxygen, the inability to lock down, those are political choices. They made lousy political choices. Don't blame that on capitalism. Don't blame that on globalization. Because, ultimately, at least pharmaceutical companies in India were making money of one kind and another. And they were a massive exporter of COVID vaccines, right, to much of the developing world. Well, they can't now because they need all those at home, because the argument goes, because they've completely mismanaged through bad domestic policy their own response to COVID. A globalization skeptic is going to say they didn't have any choice. They weren't left with enough options. Or particularly smaller, more vulnerable countries. They don't even have India's choices. They don't have those options. You either play by the rules of brutal capitalism or you get swamped in its wake. That would be like the extreme globalization skeptic. This is just as ugly as any other wave of capitalism we've ever seen. And it's going to do just as much damage. Yes, the rich will get a lot richer. The poor will stay poor, generally. Does that seem fair? Again, it's not at all important that any of you believe this stuff or agree with it. But it's important to understand that there are lots of people in positions of influence and authority who do believe these things in these ways. And also that even among rooms full of people, all of whom have PhDs or whatever the credentials are or whatever, there's no consensus. There's no consensus on development. There's no consensus on the path to development. Okay. Now, the third reading that we have suggests that for most of the history of theories of development, there was at least one basis of consensus that still is largely dominant and would even include a lot of dependency theorists. And that is the idea that development is measured as economic growth. And that if you're not growing, you're not developing. If you're not developing, then you're economically inferior in some way. Even dependency theory implies, it doesn't say, well, just go back to the way things were before. Dependency theorists would say that's impossible. Once integrated into the global economy, usually by main force through colonialism, okay, once that threshold's crossed, you can't go back to the way things were before the colonizer came. So you either find a way to get with the program and control your own destiny to some extent, or you just become a supplier of cheap resources and you remain poor for the foreseeable future. Okay. This third model, though, gives a radically different view on development. So how does this work? How with this subsistence perspective on development? What is that?
I'm the one that is presenting this one. So the author talks about subsistence economy and degrowth, and she kind of starts off the article by describing like what like a perfect world in a subsistence economy would be, and basically it's just like everybody has their needs fulfilled and nobody needs to like fight over resources because everybody is taken care of, and it's kind of like a fairy tale. She calls it a fairy tale in it. Uh she explains Carl Polanyi's thesis of self-regulating market and how it disengages society from the economy, and how this causes a fundamentalist utopia where human values are undermined and the basic substance of society is destroyed, and how the current economist principles have embedded themselves into society. And through degrowth, this means to decolonize the mindset and economist culture. The concept of subsistence has been against globalization, meaning that since the idea of economic growth at a world scale is legitimatized by the politics of development, fighting the subsistence economy is an objective of the politics of development to tear the culture of subsistence from common cultural heritage, and this would replace subsistence with commercial consumer culture. So an example would be like to draw farmers from subsistence to commercial agriculture, like from having small farmers markets to like big supermarket chains. The author realized that this could be dangerous for certain economies in different parts of the world because autonomous subsistence is needed for a lot of people, and that in this era of economic development, the economy of subsistence has become a synonym for underdevelopment, and it would bring colonization and a new formula of racism to make underdeveloped to synonym to inferior.
Okay, can we that's a really important point in her argument. Okay, this is solid start, by the way. This is a very complex argument, so you've kind of boiled it down to its essence, which is a hard thing to do. Let's kind of I hate to stop you, but I want to make sure, because you've covered so much ground. Initial assumption, she gives us this admittedly utopian view of her idea of a sustenance economy. Remember, she doesn't like to use the term subsistence. Subsistence means to subsist, it just means you have enough to get by. She's talking about a sustenance, a notion of sustenance. And that means that you're getting the things that you really need in order to thrive, right? Because if you look at that utopian model in the first couple of paragraphs, it's like a really weird but really boring 1970s science fiction movie, you know, where there's no tension at all because everybody's just got their own crash pad and everything's very psychedelic, you know, because that's the way we all want to live. It's very hippie. It's, you know, it's very pot, you know, it's very patchouli oil, tie-dye. I mean, you know, but she says, that's the way, that's a natural way for people to live. That is, they're not merely subsisting, they're not just getting by, she's saying, but they're actually getting the things they need to live fulfilled lives. So that's what she means when she differentiates between subsistence and sustenance. And it's hard, I mean, it's hard for me to say those two words in the same sentence. Okay, the other thing though that Emma just helped us with is this idea, again, on this thing we've been looking at, this model of growth as the imperative. You have to grow. And because you have to grow, we can't, in fact, we must ultimately eliminate subsistence agriculture in particular. Because if you're doing that, you're essentially self-reliant. If you're self-reliant, you're not integrated into the markets of the global economy. If you're not integrated into those markets, we can't sell you anything. We can't use you for labor. You don't serve global capitalism. In other words, she's saying something really provocative, that capitalism essentially is this beast that comes in and just swallows all the factors of production, including sovereign human beings, okay? And what it leaves in its wake, what it shits out the other end, is consumer culture. No, you've got no more sovereignty. You've got no more self-determination. But you know what you can get? A Chinese-made cell phone. Isn't that awesome? You know, so I just want to make sure, Emma, that we're really, really leaning into that, because you summarized it, you nailed it for us. But she sees this as a really destructive and really penetrative kind of force that's, and then she equates it with racism and colonialism. She says, essentially, this is the colonizer's mentality. And what she's saying there, she doesn't mean that everyone living in capitalism is a racist. What she means is that it frames the non-capitalist, pre-capitalist, counter-capitalist, ways of living in not merely oppositional terms, but in hostile and inferior terms. Okay, just as racism does with people. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's an attack on capitalism. Okay. All right, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just want to make sure those were all really important points. So go ahead and I'll try to be quiet.
Okay. Then she goes on to describe that these underdeveloped, I guess, inferior economies would be presented as a synonym for poverty and scarcity, and that they would have like an absence of markets, and that subsistence is the principal growth in nature of emergence and of evanescence. It's the maternal principle of nurturing and caring. It refers to the rhythm of life, and it is an ecological principle. She presents that this perspective of subsistence is that humans are a part of the organic process of the earth, and that the transition of civilizations from economic growth towards degrowth appears, and that to aim for subsistence allows us to make decisions in agreement with what is necessary for survival and living a happy life. Subsistence does not rely on a centralized power, but can change the world without taking power away from others. She talks about how people are skeptical of subsistence, saying that it's only a thing for the global south, or they compare it to the Stone Age. But we see ideas of subsistence in prestigious public spaces, such as a conference at the Evangelical Church of Germany, whose themes were "Take What You Need" and "What Is It That We Really Need?" and at a famous art exhibition where a piece of art was bought for the author, and with it came an envelope saying that subsistence is resistance and existence is autonomy. We see towns that use subsistence or subsistence economies. They're called transition towns, and they are around Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and they live off the philosophy that a town can flourish on its local resources in terms of providing food, building materials, providing clothing, or music. And the people in these towns have groups to teach each other how to cook and sew. Other places have urban projects on a smaller scale, such as urban gardens, that allow citizens to create community gardens in their towns to help provide food for lower income people and get people involved in their community. The predecessors of these projects are forming new social movements of communities and communes and eco-villages that promote a culture of subsistence and of equitable conviviality, and they often grow their own food. Critics say that this isn't really a form of politics, but it is, because it's actively changing the way that people think and drawing away from the Homo economicus culture, meaning that Homo economist, meaning a figurative person characterized by the infinite ability to make rational decisions. And it is it's politics of deculturalization. The ideology of growth is uniform. And Thompson talks about how the agriculture industry, farmers step out of their small markets and create supermarket chains as a reduction of this, farmers could create more community interaction on a smaller scale, and it would create more relationships. The food industry is the basis of our economy, and we see this because millions of people go hungry every year, and the United Nations took an approach to this to have world hunger, and they approached it, but didn't really approach it in a way that was successful. Subsistence theory of degrowth arose in the 60s, and oh wait, sorry, I got lost. The author talks about the German sociologist and anthropologist that began to elaborate on feminist theory of subsistence and rejected the theory of the practices of this because of the inherent colonialist racism and the similarity of the colonialist approaches to communities labeled as primitive on one hand and the oppression of women on the other. She said that it was eye-opener and was an important guide for her analysis of subsistence and degrowth. They used the idea of women as the last colony and expressed that the idea establishes the inferior social position of women. The concept of women as colony captures the anti-capitalist drive of feminist theory. And I quote on page 24, it can be seen that the subsistence perspective has, since its beginnings in 1970 and 1975, it was first called ecofeminism. Subsistence aspires to be holistic, meaning that it never claims to be a perspective only by women for women. And she goes to explain her approach is to analyze the form of being born and having the capacity to give birth, to recognize humans as a part of the reproductive process of nature. There was a section at the end that I'm kind of skipping over because the author kind of had some transphobic views in it. She talked about how like gender was biological and how it was like, it just wasn't that good. So I just kind of skipped over it. And that's all I really have on the paper.
Well, that's a lot. It is it's a very deep argument. It doesn't sprawl, but it covers a lot of ground. And in order to make sense of it, I think it is important, and she's very forthcoming with her own perspective on this, that she is informed economically by Marxism, among other things. She is informed sociologically by feminism, but it's interesting that she, maybe I'll pick up where you left off by way of sort of bringing it in for a landing. On page 25, she starts into this very interesting critique, and I think very courageous critique, where she kind of, I don't want to say she goes after gender studies, but her argument here, and the reason why the utopia that she sketches out in the first page or so makes sense to her, is because it jettisons all of these modern assumptions, including those having to do with, in air quotes, gender. Okay. She rejects the idea, for example, that let me just use her words because she says it better. It's no coincidence that the concept of, quote, gender has dominated feminist discourse in the era of neoliberal globalization. See, this ties into our last article. Gender is an ultra-liberal philosophical reflection similar to the level playing field of neoliberal economic theory. This is really brilliant. According to the concept of gender, there are no sexes. All is naturally homogeneous in the sense of being at one and the same level, enabling unbridled development from this level, free of any limitations. She rejects that categorically. And she's not wrong, really, in summarizing a lot of gender studies as having that assumption that either that, well, gender is just a social construct and it has no meaning, okay, and detonating the whole notion that gender matters, or kind of rejecting the idea that there is a feminism that is not about absolute equality, okay? In other words, it concedes that, you know, there are differences. Even if we think of sexuality as a spectrum, there are meaningful differences, she's trying to argue. Without being a biological determinist, right? She's arguing in part, it's not all social construct and it doesn't create a level playing field if you just annihilate the notion of gender, okay? And you dismiss it as merely a social construct, that it's a false model. It's, you know, she would refer to that as being just as false as the confidence in the market forces is for capitalism, okay? She ties those things together in a way that I very seldom have seen, certainly never seen in development studies, but also really never seen in gender or feminist studies or any of that kind of stuff. So this is provocative stuff. And yet she's clearly a feminist. And so what she's trying to argue that makes it, from her point of view, it makes everything that Emma was saying make sense, is that this is not about level playing fields. It's about diversity, but in the absolute sense that people need to be able to determine their lives. They need to be able to determine at the very local level, this is the way we're going to live. And that's where this notion of not merely subsistence, but sustenance comes in, that different people will be nurtured by different things, okay? And in a very oblique way, it may indeed be linked to the old Marxist notion of from each according ability to each according to need. The general assumption there among Marx and Engels being not everybody needs the same things, but everybody has needs. And socialism, for it to work, has to satisfy those needs. This is a common misconception with people who dismiss Marx and think they understand Marx and can dismiss that Marx was not talking about a uniform society where everyone was the same and everyone wore, you know, gray cardboard clothing or something. He understood that we all have complex natures, okay? That, you know, the classic example was because he gets a little rhapsodic in a lot of his writing where he talks about, and she's very much informed by this, the idea that, well, in the morning, you might be a fisherman. You might go out and fish or gather food. In the afternoon, you might teach some children something that you know. In the evening, you might perform at a concert or something like that. That in fact, people they're complex beings and they have multiple needs and multiple ways in which they can contribute. Well, that's absolutely true. But what Thompson's critique of capitalism is that it negates that. It compels us to specialize. And the most grotesque specialization for her is the specialization as consumer, right? She's appalled by that. So when she's wrapping this up at the end, and she's trying to tie back into what for her is not as crazy and silly a utopian idea as it might appear in the first page or so, is by saying, you know what, if you liberate people in the meaningful sense of the word, to actualize themselves and their relationships with others in ways that are localized, immediate, and spontaneous, ultimately human, all right? You don't strip them of their humanity. You preserve that because it's the most important thing. But you allow them then real sovereignty to determine, you know, first of all, to understand what their real needs are, but also to understand what their capabilities are, okay? And the growth model of development just says, look, never mind all that. You just need a new cell phone. You need to upgrade, you know, your cable service. You know, you need to go binge watch something on Netflix. You'll be fine. Just go watch some more Game of Thrones or fill in the blank for whatever the happening thing is at any given time. What she's interested in, and I've only read a little bit of her work, but I'm very intrigued by her perspective, partly because a lot of what she writes is not it's not in English, it has to be translated. But she's very interested in this idea, and it is a Marxist idea at its core, of the variegated nature of the individual, that you are so many things that are, you're not merely a thing. And the critique, Marx does this, but the Marxist critique of the kind of capitalist consumer society is the objectification of things, that you make of a person a commodity, you make of a person an object. And for Marx, that was an imperative of capitalism. You can exploit an object. Can you exploit a human being? And this is why she uses that metaphor of colonialism, that you're colonizing people's minds with this idea that, they are merely what you allow them to be. Okay. They're merely a factor of production. They're merely a consumer. They're merely an audience, right? Think of the difference between, I don't know how many of you grew up around music or participated in music, but for me, the ultimate musical experience is not going to an arena with 40,000 people to watch, some big prefabricated performance. It's going into some club someplace or somebody's house, cranking up a 40-watt amplifier with everybody else around and playing music spontaneously. All right. That's what she's talking about. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems like whenever I use music as an example, people are like, oh, God, there he goes again. But it is one of those things that can be incredibly liberating. And she is, it's clear, she is interested in the emancipation of the human spirit. Okay. That's what she's really talking about. Okay. And that makes a lot of people in modern Western traditions very nervous, and I would argue it makes a lot of students in my classes very nervous to really think about, well, what happens if I'm really emancipated? What is there left? Where's the net? Well, her idea is the net is your community. The net will catch you when you fall. The community will catch you when you fall. Now, is she being kind of idealistic? Yeah, she is. But what she would say is, so is the person who has absolute blind evangelical faith in market forces. They're just as idealistic. They're just as blind, or just as optimistic, or whatever. So she's trying to say that, just the very freedom that she has to envision these different ways of being, and this notion of degrowth, the idea that maybe what you need as a community is less of some things. It's informed by an assumption about localization. The more that you localize, the less variety you have, unless you live in a society that's variegated. She doesn't come to terms with a lot of that in this relatively brief piece, but it's one of the most provocative things that I found in terms of, I kept thinking, for the last couple of years, I need a good alternative to these growth-oriented, models of development. This is the best one I've come up with so far. However, what I'm most interested in is how you respond to that, because she's kind of she's not talking to me. She's talking to you, because she sees this as your future. If you do things, if you accept that mantle of freedom and all the responsibility that it takes. And she's not saying it's fun. She's saying it's human. Does that make sense? What, we got a little bit of time. I don't want to keep you too long, because I know we covered a lot of material today. I mean, excellent job, all of you. But that last article was incredibly challenging, and I know you were trying to get every essence of that in there. I think you did manage to identify the things that were really critical to her argument. So well done there. But what do you think about this idea? Is it silly, or is it, does it sound good until you start really thinking about it, and then all of a sudden it sounds utopian and stupid? Or what do you think?
I thought it was interesting. I don't know much about economics and like how all that works. So I thought it was an interesting perspective and very different from like what I've learned previously in economics classes. So I thought it was just interesting to read about.
Yeah, well, it's rare that you get someone who will offer up such a dramatic departure from the status quo analysis of growth and development and all that. And again, that's why I thought it was important. But I mean, I don't choose these readings for me. I choose them because I think they might spark something interesting with you. But It's always interesting to get your students' reactions to, because it's a completely different generation and different priorities, different uncertainties. This, how plausible does this seem? Sorry, Carl, you started to say
It was
something.
one of my favorite things. I was in freshman year. There was like a little econ get together with some professors and students, right? And this one guy pulls me to the side, Don McClurkin. He's like, "Hey, you and the other dude, do you want to know why capitalism is going to fail?" And it's just a 3-hour lecture of basically like the failure of markets and how capital gets concentrated, and then that leads to a series of bubbles, and then that ends up collapsing the system entirely. And so he's part of the what's called the Post-Growth Institute, the idea that eventually we will go beyond growth. So I think this kind of thing it's in some senses idealistic, in some senses it has to happen. So I think I didn't actually read the article because I was really focused on mine. I have a bad habit of doing that. But I think this kind of argument is part of this has to happen. I don't think all of it ever will. But I think there's definitely some parts of this subsistence argument that are eventually going to have to be incorporated into far future societies, or else capitalism collapses on itself.
Well, how much of it depends on what we define as subsistence? And what about the distinction that she sometimes appears to make, at least, I think she could have clarified that more, between subsistence and sustenance? I mean, what's the limitation of this model realistically? I mean, it's not a crime to want the things that she talks about, right?
I think, and to me, the major limitation is the power of specialization in many cases. To me, the major limitation is like these local communities seem really great, but there are also some very clear advantages of like non-local global communities that you can get a variety of goods and services from that can clearly satisfy people. And this, like, if a good or service satisfies someone, it doesn't matter where it comes from necessarily in a lot of cases. And so I think that's where this whole thing doesn't necessarily come together, because there are advantages to global capitalism, as you will, I guess.
Well, you can argue, depending on whether you're on the side of the angels or not. That is, are you with the winners or the losers? Certainly, you can argue that there are benefits, depending on how you define benefit. There are benefits of global capitalism. But I would also suggest whenever people, I'm trying to be fair here. When people criticize utopian models or models like this or alternative models or Marxism or anything else, almost always the initial go-to is somehow, well, it doesn't really square the circle. It doesn't really tell us how we're going to get there. I would suggest to you that capitalism doesn't either. Capitalism is an article of faith. It really is. I mean, market forces, are not tangible powers that you can hold in your hand. They're articles of faith. What is the value of an American dollar right now? It's what someone says it is. That's an article of faith. What is the value of gold? Now, there's something you can hold in your hand, but you know what you can't hold in your hand? The value of that gold. You can hold gold in your hand, but you don't determine its value. Scarcity and a perceived desire for it are what determine that. Those are perceptions. Those are impressions. There's nothing metaphysically certain about value.
Well, there's something certain. You could say there's something certain about scarcity.
Yeah, that's
Unless
right.
we're going to go to a post-scarcity society, which would be super cool.
What I'm saying is, who cares if there's a scarcity of gold? I don't need gold. And then somebody says, yeah, you do, because some of the stuff you use is made out of gold. Well, then I'll stop using that stuff. The hell with it.
I mean, you're using gold right now, a little bit.
I know, but you know what? If I was in the classroom right now, for example,
that's true. You wouldn't be using any gold.
Wouldn't be using much gold.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? In other words, capitalism doesn't answer its own questions. It doesn't. It's nonsense to assume that it does.
Yeah.
The notion of creative destruction doesn't explain to us why inefficiencies happen necessarily. But even insofar as it doesn't explain why the best thing to do with inefficiency is not to improve it, but to destroy it. You know, it doesn't explain competition. It assumes that competition is an inevitable component of every human being when we know that's not true. We know that's not true. We know that the vast majority of human beings are overwhelmingly risk averse. You know what? That's not a natural capitalist. So that's what I mean. And it's not to decry capitalism, but just to say there are, and this is what, Thompson's trying to point out, there are as many articles of evangelical faith in capitalism as there are in any other utopian model. There really are. And this is one of the things, with respect to the globalization and dependency argument, that a lot of the global skeptics would say is, look, don't invest in that. It's not God, okay? It's not a corrective force. You can't pray to it. It's indifferent to you, and it's going to crush you if you get in its way. Well, that's not terribly, what's that? But that groups the money in one place. What groups the money in one place? I
Oh, that
don't
was
know.
I was running the wrong thing.
Okay, sorry.
Ignore.
But anyway, what I'm trying to do is follow through from her point of view. She would say all of this stuff has a utopian element to it. If you want to know that for sure, go back and read the problematic ability of some people to try and convince people that capitalism was a great thing. Go back and read Adam Smith again, because I'm going to bet that most of you've never read Adam Smith. Okay. That's the architecture of market capitalism right there. And even Adam Smith, half the time, doesn't know for sure what he's saying. I mean, what does he really mean by the invisible hand? What does he really mean when he says that, you can have no intention of doing good at all, and yet you can, by your own self-interested actions, do good? Yeah, you can also do a lot of harm, I mean, that's what I mean. There is a certain utopian nature to that, a certain kind of, this is the best way to live, which is ultimately what a utopia is. What's the best way for human beings to live? Well, it's easy to make an argument that the best way for human beings to live and thrive is not capitalism. I would argue it misses the point, because I don't think human beings have the restraint, the discipline, or the inherent genius to live the best possible lives. It takes discipline, it takes sacrifice, and a lot of things that human beings aren't ready for. Okay. In that sense, all of these systems are dysfunctional. This utopian, a sustenance or a subsistence model is utopian. Capitalism as a high tide lifting all boats is nonsense. It's never happened. Okay. But if instead of looking at them as modalities of desire, if you look at them as explanations for how things work, I think they make a lot more sense. And I think the distinction is important. Okay. I think it's as important as the distinction between just eking out an existence because you got enough starch to keep your body moving and enough water to keep from drying out, between that and actually having a way of living that actually sustains you in the sense of the things that you need to thrive, not just to survive, but to thrive. It's the difference between living as mere existence and living as accomplishing things, producing things, discovering things. Those are very different ideas, and the one is easy to do. You can eat just a little bit and drink just a little bit and you'll last as long as you're built to last. But as far as making productive use of that time, the first and most courageous step to take is what is it that I should produce? What is it that I know how to do? How much am I willing to sacrifice my free time or my leisure or whatever in order to provide something that might be of use to people? I don't think most people ask themselves that kind of question. If they don't, then the kind of model she's proposing here is ridiculous, because it demands a lot of people. It really does. It demands a lot of sacrifice. This notion of degrowth demands a lot of sacrifice. It's not easy. Not easy at all. And for a lot of us, the default position is, look, just don't, you can be demanding a lot of me. Like you can pay me shit wages for hard work, but if you don't remind me of it very often, I'll keep doing it. And if in the meantime, every once in a while, you let me run up some debt so that I can buy a couple of cool things, you know what? I probably am not going to be a problem for you because I'm not really thinking about my life having value. I just want to escape the boredom of a vacuous, pointless existence. You know, I mean, that's the modern dilemma, I think. And she's trying to get at that sort of quality of life question, as opposed to just, hey, there's all kinds of stuff. You know, it's like people are always surprised that I never, ever had any desire to live in New York City. And it was all, the arguments always were, there's all kinds of stuff. You know, there's all these shows you can go to, or there's this, or there's that. And I'm thinking, first of all, there's nothing there that I want. There's nothing there that I value. And there's everything that I would give up in terms of what I do want to go live in a place like that. I wouldn't want to do it. But the prevailing development model assumes that there is a way that you can kind of, you know, square the circle, and that is economic growth. As long as the economy is growing, problems will be solved. And that has informed most of development theory for the last 100 years. Okay? Certainly for the last 70, 80 years. All right, any questions? All right, because what I have just done, let me make sure I have, in fact, done this correctly. Yeah, the next assignment, Sunday is the 16th, is that right? Yes. It just says, in a concise analytical essay of approximately 2 to 3 pages, I've tried to make this as general as I can. Discuss the ways in which the assigned readings inform our understanding of the challenges of political and economic development. Now, I mean, there are many rooms in that mansion. There are a lot of ways to address that. So this should not be a difficult assignment if you've read. You do not have to use all of the sources. There are only 3. I would prefer that you use at least 2. Okay. Obviously, if you presented, you don't have to write. Okay, we've already talked about that. That's not a surprise, right? You understand that. Okay, so there are a few of you who have to write and a few of you who don't. Okay, so what we'll do is next week we'll be moving on to, there's some stuff on colonialism and development, and there's a thing that I wrote that I actually got in trouble for on, it's called Despotism and Deferred Development on Eritrea, post-revolution, post-Civil War, whatever, post-war. And then there's a thing on the Global South. It's a kind of an extension of development into the so-called developing world, rather from the point of view of the development patrons. We're now looking at the development clients in a sense. Okay, anything else? Okay, so by Sunday, you'll have that done, right? Again, if you, you're not sure you're approaching it right, you want to send me like an introductory paragraph, or you know, a thesis statement with an outline or something for me to look at your thinking, I'm happy to do that. I would prefer to do it before Sunday morning though, you know, so that I have some time to think about it and respond. All right. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Okay. All right.